Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and with this lecture we're going to begin by examining the opinions in the Free States and the election of 1872. But before we begin our lecture proper, I just like to do a customary recap and touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we looked at the corruption in Grant's administration and how that negatively affected the reputation of the Reconstruction governments. We looked at the federal crackdown, or the attempt at federal crackdown on the Redeemer groups, but it was largely impossible because the Redeemer groups operated in an atmosphere, in an environment in which they could easily slip away and blend into existing European American populations, and basically be hidden, be protected by that community. They have widespread support. We looked at the terror campaign, particularly the beating of Georgia Representative Abram Colby, the rise of lynchings, which became the preferred method of murder by these groups, the attacks on Utah, Alabama in 1870, the siege of Colfax, Louisiana in 1873, the fact that this violence was warlike in its scale, that particularly in the siege of Colfax, a war cannon was used to sort of render the defenses of the African Americans and their allies there useless, to nullify those defenses because they couldn't protect against a war cannon, heavy cannon. And so with that, we'll sort of segue into the election of 1872, and again we're continuing on with this theme of corruption. Horace Greeley was the guy who Grant ran against in 1872, and Greeley, he was actually favored by a little group, a small group really, in the Republican Party, and this group was known as the Liberal Republicans. They met in Cincinnati and they nominated him to unseat Grant. Now, this group, the Liberal Republicans, their primary concern was civil service reform. They wanted to stem the corruption, and they really wanted to heal the party's image. They also called for the withdrawal of all military forces from the former rebel states. They called for the restoration of local self-government, by which they meant white democratic rule. They were ready to concede the entire region to the Democrats. They wanted amnesty for all ex-Confederates who were still being deprived of their voting rights. Not all ex-Confederates were deprived, but there was still about 10% of the 1860 Confederate population that was being deprived of their voting rights, stemming from their treason against the federal government, against the Republic. And this was done to attract support from what they deemed the better element of the Democratic Party. And Horace Greeley was elected as their nominee. Now, Greeley had a very checkered past. He had many strong opinions, and Greeley was a man who had literally been on every side of every political controversy for the past about 20 years or so. He was an almost comical figure, with off-putting personal habits, and at the Democratic Convention of 1872, he was backed as president by the Democrats. Now, both groups, both the Democrats and the Liberal Republicans, believed that only Greeley stood a chance of realistically defeating Grant. Grant was enormously popular with the African American community. He was enormously popular with the American military. War veterans liked him. Everybody remember Grant as the guy who beat Lee, the guy who won at Vicksburg, the guy who was this titan. He was Lincoln's guy. He was Lincoln's general. And he was a really likable guy. He was a good family man. He had this very deep and enduring relationship with his wife. The administration, like I said, was flawed, deeply flawed. Grant was not. Everybody knew that Grant wasn't flawed. Um, it was it would be tough to defeat Grant, but its backers, the Greeley supporters, thought that he stood the very best chance of defeating Grant. Now, now Grant, for his part, he was nonetheless favored. He was nonetheless, even with all the corruption charges, he was nominated by the Republican Party for re-election. And there was really never really a chance of anyone else being nominated by the majority of Republicans. They all backed him. And the election of 1872 centered on sectional reconciliation. Now, the voting showed that most Republicans were not ready to forgive or embrace ex-Confederates. The campaign was very emotional and very harsh. One political cartoon showed Horace Greeley reaching out and shaking the hand of John Wilkes Booth over Lincoln's grave. There was very strong support from abolitionists, former war veterans, African Americans, and really everyone who was just distrustful of anyone who was just really distrustful of the Democrats or ex-Confederates. All of those elements propelled Grant to re-election. He carried all of the free states and 10 of the former slave states. The Republican Party retained firm control over Congress. The election of 1872 appeared to be a smashing success for Grant and the Republican Party. But this was an illusion. The Republicans soon began to lose ground in the ex-rebel states. After the election, Grant's election, the campaign against the Ku Klux Klan and other things seemed to point to a prevailing current that was being driven home to the ex-Confederates that they had lost the war, that the world has changed, but in fact, Reconstruction were quickly losing steam. Many people in the free states they just been exhausted. They were tired of the troubles of Reconstruction. They really thought that enough protection for African Americans had been put into place. They felt that the Civil Rights Amendments were enough, that there was nothing else that should be asked for them because there was nothing else that they could do. Had more corruption charges were leveled at the Reconstruction governments, the most damaging in Louisiana. And Louisiana is very interesting because Louisiana had a very long history of corruption. The Louisiana state government had been corrupt before the war. It had been corrupt during the war, during Reconstruction, and will remain corrupt long after Reconstruction. It wouldn't be really until Huey Long that Louisiana corruption was sort of dealt with, that it was sort of rectified. But even that was bad because Huey Long's solution to Louisiana state corruption was to punish those people, the people who profited and participated in that corruption, punish them, but put his subordinates in their place. So not much of a solution by Huey Long. But Louisiana has long been corrupt, and the worst excesses of corruption didn't even happen during Reconstruction, as far as Louisiana is concerned. But support for African American rights was never really profound amongst the free state population and the Western territories. It was never really profound except among radical Republicans. Much of the pro-African American legislation had been designed not to help African Americans, but to punish ex-Confederates, especially the former slavocrats. Looking back at emancipation had more to do with hurting Confederate war effort than really helping African Americans. It was a political war tool to many people, not a boon to slaves. The Republic of the 19th century was an intensely racist place. The racial attitudes were very far removed from what we would consider appropriate or acceptable. After this long focus on Reconstruction, many people in the free states, in the Western territories, and the Western states, they were just ready to embark on new priorities. And the biggest priority of all for these people was namely settling and exploiting the Western lands. Redeemers generally targeted African American communities and local Republicans. But they were also bitterly opposed to the Republican Party, and they were keenly aware that the only reason that they were kept from completing their violent, frenzied reconquest of their homeland was because of outside support from Northern and Western pro-Reconstructionists. After the Civil War, there was an inordinate amount of anti-Southern sentiment, anti-slave state, anti-Confederate sentiment in the other states. This led to widespread support for Reconstruction governments in the other states. Now, this marriage of convenience did not last long. Opinions remained strong regarding punishing ex-Confederates, but many grew weary of the race situation in the ex-slave states. Recalcitrance of the Redeemer groups left many feeling that it was a dead cause. It was a dead cause to try and change them. Though the violence was primarily one-sided, many people outside of the slave states were led to believe that the Redeemers and African Americans were equally committing violent acts against one another in equal proportion. Many began to express an interest in removing federal troops from the region and letting the competing factions fight it out amongst themselves for control. Reports of corruption by the Reconstruction governments also turned opinion against continuing support for Reconstruction. Redeemers blamed their opponents, African Americans, free state adventurers, and the sympathetic slave staters, the sympathetic local elites, for the corruption. And with this increase in spending and construction being done in all quarters of the Republic, there's no doubt that corruption was widespread. There was no escaping government corruption in its era. Like I said, to the victor goes the spoils. That spoils system that Andrew Jackson had championed and really sort of trailblazed in the upper echelons of the federal government really came out. It really came down. Really just sort of came out and really just flared. During this time, it was almost like a supernova effect as far as government corruption. Indeed, the era following the Civil War and Reconstruction is known as the age of the robber baron for this kind of excess. And the robber baron age leads into the Gilded Age. There was this very excessive grafting, this very excessive sort of frenzied taking place, this very frenzied corruption. Now, the corruption and lingering race question was soon joined by widespread controversial labor and social disputes in the 1870s. Confronting such issues close to home has earning livable wages and keeping farms operational and profitable made the far and distant problems of the freedmen less pressing. At this time, the Republican Party leadership were coming to a conclusion that the alliance with freedmen was not necessary to maintain control of the national government. A generation of middle-class Civil War veterans had become the majority in the former free states. The realignment of the Republican political base led to the immediate collapse of the radical Republicans. And with the collapse of the radical Republicans, also came the collapse of Reconstruction. In 1874, the Democrats won control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 18 years, really since 1856. They had lost control. Massachusetts, the most ardently Republican, Republican state from the most ardently Republican section of the country, elected a Democratic governor. Party leaders thought that the bad economy was to blame for the losses, and the economy was going through some turmoil at the time. There was an economic panic going on, but had the economic panic occurred in the early 1870s, they also recognized that voters were showing their displeasure. Excuse me. They also recognized that voters were showing their displeasure with Reconstruction. In 1875, they decided to drop their support for Reconstruction governments. This led to uniform apathy when African Americans appealed for help in the wake of Redeemer violence. This final break allowed the Redeemers to complete their redemption of the former slave states. One by one, the Reconstruction governments fell and the Democratic Party came back into power. To give a broad overview, you had Tennessee falling to Redeemers in 1869, North Carolina and Virginia in 1870, Georgia 1871, Texas 1873, Arkansas and Alabama 1874, and Mississippi in 1876. By 1876, the end of Reconstruction in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida was near. The centennial year, that is 1876, was not looked forward to with much joy. The 8 years of Grant's presidency had been a roller coaster of scandal. Corruption was flagrant, and the national economy was faltering on a level unseen before. Now, the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877 spelled the end of Reconstruction. By 1876, Reconstruction had ended, and the former rebel states, except Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, those were the only three states. Those were the last three states under Reconstruction. The Grant administration had been rocked by a series of controversies. Democrats saw an opening to steal the presidency, and they pounced on it. They nominated Samuel Tilden, a reformer who had helped break the power of Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall in New York State. Tammany Hall, of course, is the political organ, the political machine founded by Aaron Burr, the notorious Aaron Burr, Thomas Jefferson's first vice president. The Democratic Party called for reform and an end to the remaining Reconstruction governments. The Republicans, for their part, nominated Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, Hayes had served as a United States general during the war. He had amassed a good service record, and he was a moderate on Reconstruction. Now, the nominees reflected the current state of the Republic, with unemployment soaring, industry faltering, and the and the Republican nominee Rutherford B. Hayes, a former governor of Ohio with a spotless record and really known as a moderate on Reconstruction, going up against Tilden, the anti-corruption governor of New York. Now, the election of 1876 remains one of the most controversial and politically important elections in the history of the Republic. Violence was rampant during the campaign, but we'll cut here and we'll come back. We'll come back in our next lecture. We'll come back in our next lecture to wrap up Reconstruction and to sort of delve into how this election impacted Reconstruction and how this decision sort of brought satisfaction to the Redeemer cause. As always, I am Ted, Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. Let me know what you thought about the ongoing series on Reconstruction. And as always, I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.